Hey everyone! In this video, we'll review a very interesting glitch referred to as G-Mode, which stands for Gray Mode or God Mode. In this bizarre state, Samus will be able to move around freely, but the game will behave in some ways as though X-ray scope is activated, which allows you to do all sorts of weird things. First, I want to give a shout out to French Lightning John, who was kind enough to share his expertise with me. Without his help, I wouldn't have been able to make this video as detailed as it is. Thank you so much. Before we delve into G-Mode, it's helpful to first understand R-Mode, or Reserve Mode. To enter R-Mode, you will need to have X-ray scope and at least one reserve tank with energy in it. The reserve tank should be set to auto. Then, you need to find a door transition at which there is an enemy that can hit Samus during the door transition itself. Find out how much damage this enemy deals to Samus. Then, lower your energy count until it is less than or equal to the amount of damage the enemy deals. Now, select your X-ray scope and position yourself as close as possible to the door transition. One technique that may help, though it's not necessary, is to moonwalk towards the door until Samus's visor is barely fully visible. Then, with X-ray scope active, turn around and then deactivate X-ray. You should be very close to the transition now. Just before the enemy hits Samus, move into the door transition. It's critical that the door transition begins before the enemy hits Samus. It should hit you as the transition occurs. Once the transition begins, hold down the dash button, which will result in the X-ray scope activating on the first possible frame when the next room loads. Keep X-ray activated while your reserves deploy, which they should do automatically. After your reserves have emptied, you can release the dash button. If done correctly, you'll be in R mode. The door behind you should be closed, and the room should be significantly dimmed. While R mode isn't entirely useless, G mode is definitely more useful, and in my opinion, much more interesting. The setup for G mode is very similar to R mode, but before you attempt G mode, take note of exactly how much energy is in Samus's reserves. Then perform all the same steps as you would to enter R mode. Here's the difference. After the next room loads, you need to release the dash button and thereby deactivate X-ray scope just as your reserves are finishing deploying. This is why you need to know exactly how much reserve energy you have. Releasing the dash button isn't frame perfect, but it's definitely a small window. I believe it's about 3 or 4 frames. A simple way to tell that you are successful is if the door behind you stays open. If the door is open and the screen is dimmed, you're in G mode. If you release the dash button too late, you'll be in R mode, and the door will be closed. If you release dash too early, everything will be normal. You'll now notice that Samus can't move, aside from just turning around in place. This is Immobile G-Mode. In order to move around freely, Samus first needs to get hit by an enemy. The knockback from the enemy will free her. If there are no enemies that can hit Samus in the room you enter, you're basically soft-locked. So you have to choose carefully where you attempt Immobile G-Mode. Fortunately, Mobile G-Mode is possible as well, and I'll get to that in a second. First, an interesting thing about Immobile G-Mode is that you can use it to basically trick the game into putting Samus into the morphing ball even if you don't have morphing ball, or it's unequipped. To do this, you just have to turn Samus around during the enemy knockback. If you time it right, Samus will be forced into the morphing ball, regardless of whether she has that item. Now, to achieve Mobile G-Mode, the setup is the same, except that you need to have between 1 and 4 energy in your reserves. 4 is optimal, as it gives you the widest possible window in which to release the dash button. Here's just one easy way to get exactly 4 energy in your reserves. Refill at Samus's ship, and then manually empty your reserves. Head into the room known as Parlor, and if you have Gravity Suit, these Gamers will only deal 1 damage. Let one of them hit Samus, and then collect a small energy drop. You'll now have 4 in your reserves. Anyway, once your energy and reserves are optimized for Mobile G-Mode, follow all the same steps as for Immobile G-Mode. The difference here is that because there is so little energy in your reserves, you'll have to let go of the dash button very shortly after the next room loads. It'll take some practice to get the timing down, but once you get it, it's not overly difficult. A great place to practice is at this save station off of Bubble Mountain. This is because, just when you leave the save room with your optimized energy and reserves, this waiver will fly right at you, allowing you to attempt G-Mode. You may be wondering why you need between 1 and 4 reserve energy to achieve Mobile G-Mode. Remember how enemy knockback freed Samus from Immobile G-Mode? That's what we're taking advantage of here. When Samus is hit by an enemy, she gets 5 frames of knockback. When attempting to enter G-Mode, this knockback doesn't occur until after the door transition. By having only 1 to 4 reserve energy, you ensure that after your reserves have finished deploying, you'll still have at least 1 frame of knockback left, which will free Samus from the immobile state. It's also important to note that you can easily exit G-Mode by simply activating the X-ray scope, at which point you'll enter R-Mode. The main reason that this is important is because in G-Mode, you won't be able to open any doors. The door behind Samus when you initially enter G-Mode will stay open, but all other doors will effectively be locked until you exit G-Mode. So, what does G-Mode actually do? As mentioned earlier, in G-Mode the game behaves in some ways as though X-ray scope is still active. This means that the game is unable to execute things called PLMs, or post-load modifications. PLMs include things like door animations, item collection fanfares, item drops from enemies, crumble blocks and other destructible blocks, and screen scroll controllers, among others. G-Mode can also cause some odd graphical glitches. Let's look at some examples. First off, performing a crystal flash in G-Mode can result in an interesting glitch where an oval spotlight, so to speak, remains on the screen and kind of follows Samus around. It looks particularly striking if you perform the glitch in a room with fire fleas and then kill all the fire fleas, making the entire room pitch black, except for the oval spotlight. Things get even weirder if you lay a power bomb after performing the crystal flash. In some rooms, such as the landing site, this will happen. It's fun to try to navigate the room in this state. As seen here, when you kill enemies in G-Mode, they don't drop any items, and you won't see the little explosion animations, at least until you enter R-Mode by activating the X-ray scope. Then, all the explosions and item drops will appear simultaneously. Another interesting thing is that if you enter Mother Brain's room in G-Mode, you can get through the Zebatites just fine, but when you arrive at Mother Brain, you won't be able to break open her tank, no matter how many missiles you shoot. But if you enter R-Mode, the tank will become breakable. And here's a nice example of how crumble blocks don't function properly in G-Mode. You can simply walk across the so-called noob bridge with no issues. However, once you activate the X-ray scope, all the blocks you stepped on will crumble at the same time. Another important thing to note is the distinction between direct and indirect G-Mode, because they do have some different properties. Direct G-Mode refers to the state of G-Mode in the room you initially enter. As seen here, in direct G-Mode, items such as missiles will spawn, but the item collection fanfare won't actually play, and you won't acquire the item until you exit G-Mode using X-ray. However, in indirect G-Mode, which occurs when you enter a new room while already in G-Mode, items won't spawn at all until you activate X-ray, as seen here. This distinction will be important to understand in just a minute. Using G-Mode, you can do some pretty weird things. For example, you may remember the mini-boss Spore Spawn. Normally, after defeating it, you head upwards and then fall through some crumble blocks down a long shaft to ultimately get a pack of super missiles. Those crumble blocks normally prevent you from going up the shaft and entering Spore Spawn's room from the top. However, in G-Mode, you can pass right through those blocks and enter the Spore Spawn fight from above. Not surprisingly, the game doesn't like that very much, and things get pretty glitchy. As far as I can tell, there's no way to kill Spore Spawn from up above. This is completely useless, but it's kind of fun to try out. Now, let's move on to applications of G-Mode that have actually been utilized in either tool-assisted or human speedruns of Super Metroid. You may be aware of the green gate glitch, which allows you to get through left-facing green gates from the wrong side. Generally speaking, this doesn't work for right-facing green gates, such as this one, which normally prevents you from entering Meridia from the Red Tower elevator room in Brinstar. This is intended to just be an exit from Meridia. However, if you enter indirect G-Mode, this green gate will not spawn at all, so you can pass right through to Meridia. But as I briefly mentioned before, screen scrolling is messed up in G-Mode, so the screen won't follow you to the right. Just keep going right until you can't progress further, as seen here. Then exit G-Mode using X-Ray, shoot open the door, and enter Meridia. You can also use G-Mode to enter Lower Norfair from what is normally its exit. As you may recall, when you exit Lower Norfair in normal gameplay, you fall through a bunch of crumble blocks that would typically prevent you from backtracking. But in G-Mode, you can pass right through those crumble blocks. Once again, the screen won't be able to follow you to the right, so you'll have to do this blindly. It's not very hard though. Just keep jumping towards the right, and you'll eventually reach the door to Lower Norfair. But it may help to familiarize yourself with the room layout prior to attempting this. Once you're there, exit G-Mode and shoot open the door. If you choose to use Mobile G-Mode for this, you'll only have between 1 and 4 energy when you enter Lower Norfair, which means you either have to be extremely careful or perform a Crystal Flash if you have the ammo for it. Alternatively, you can use Immobile G-Mode, which will allow you to enter Lower Norfair with significantly more energy. Finally, I'll show you my favorite application of G-Mode, although this one is very tricky to pull off. When Samus enters a save station while in G-Mode, the game tries to pull up the typical save dialog box, but it can't because that's a PLM. The game ultimately starts cycling through all the available PLMs, and once you exit G-Mode by activating X-Ray, the currently selected PLM will be executed, whatever that is. PLMs include items, so if you time it correctly, you can get things like Gravity Suit. If you want to see Shiny Zenny pull this off in his world record speedrun of the RBO glitched category, check out the link in my video description. I do want to point out that depending on the PLM executed, the game might crash, as seen here. In this case, one of my save files was actually deleted. So try this at your own risk. Thanks for watching everyone, and have fun in G-Mode.